My name's Max Rashbrooke, and it's my great pleasure to chair this panel. We're going to be talking about Wellington and the new occupants of the Beehive. How does a progressive city deal with a conservative government? Lots to talk about, and I'm delighted to be joined by our three panellists. We have in the centre Julie Anne Genter, MP for Rongotai, of course, as of recently, but also former Associate Minister for Transport and for Health and former Minister for Women. To her left, Dave Armstrong is a regular commentator. Many of you will know his columns for The Post. And finally, Ian Cassels is, of course, one of our highest profile property developers, possibly also one of our highest property developers, although you don't even like the term property developer, do you, Ian? So we won't dwell on that. Look, we've got lots to be talking about here: urban form, transport, densification, and the whole relationship between local and central government. Before we dive right into the big questions, though, I thought I might start with a little icebreaker, since this is our city and a city we all love, and I thought I'd like to hear from each of the panellists, what's your favourite Wellington building? And we'll start with Ian. Now, Ian, you're not allowed to name one of your own buildings. Well, I mean, actually, you can if you really want to, but anyway, your favourite Wellington building?
It's really hard, I'm not sure. Okay, well, I'll say that? I'd like to say one of my own. Go on. Yep. It's got a number of reasons. I'd like to say the Spark building, and it really was a reaction to office buildings moving down to the waterfront. So it's got a much better purpose than what it seems to achieve, and I think it succeeded. So. Sorry about that. I just couldn't. No, that's good. I'll pass it on.
Please take your time, as this is a tough question. I mean, what pops into my mind is a little bit old-fashioned, and it is in Newtown at the junction of Redeford and Rintoul Street, that one that kind of, to me, reminds me of a real famous building in New York, although not as high. But yeah, lovely building. And I love the mural on it with the Tekiko cabbage trees. You've got that.
Hello, yes. Yeah, well, I look at this, it's in a way an easy question. I'm a retired classical musician, so I tend to judge buildings by acoustics. And I was brought up an atheist by my father, and when Mormons and religious people came to the door, he used to say, I'm an atheist and a Marxist, now fuck off. And so he's going to be turning in his grave when I say one of my favourite buildings is St Andrews on the Terrace, because it's just an amazing acoustic, as is, I dare say it, the Wellington Town Hall.
Excellent answers. My own favourite, personally, is the Futuna Chapel in Karori. Wonderful building, beautiful bit of architecture. Highly recommend a visit if you haven't been there. All right, moving on to the serious stuff. So the core of the subject today is the very obvious fact that we have a city that now tilts progressive very strongly in its politics. We have, of course, Julie Anne Genter and Tamitha Paul as new Green MPs for the city centre. We have a city council with a Green Labour majority and a city that just generally trends left. Conversely, of course, sitting atop all of this, a newly established national government, national-led coalition government that is definitely conservative in its inclinations and is at odds with the city's civic leaders on a number of major issues. So my opening question is, in this dynamic, how does Wellington get the things that it wants? Does it stand on its mandate and say, well, we've been elected locally to represent this city and what it needs? Does Wellington demand what it needs to central government? Or does it acknowledge the reality that in New Zealand's constitutional setup, central government holds pretty well a lot of the power and virtually all of the purse strings? Does Wellington just work with that, try and get some little tactical victories as and when it can? Does it go for confrontation or conciliation? And I thought, Julie Anne, I might start with you on that. Which of those approaches do you favour?
Well, I don't know yet what will be successful, but I was possibly delusionally hopeful the day after the election when I looked, and that was before the specials increased the votes for Greens and Labour. that less than a quarter of the electorate, at least my electorate, Rongotai, voted for National Enact, that many of the things that we were standing on and campaigning on actually make more economic sense than what the government's proposing, certainly costs less money, and that's an opportunity to pitch to them that they don't need to carry out their election promises here in Wellington, because they don't really have many votes to lose here anyway. And they should recognize that most of the people in the city have voted for a very different vision, and that vision may actually be more achievable and more electorally beneficial to them to embrace. But yeah, that was probably too hopeful, really.
Oh, look, I think just as an observer, not a member of any political party, you can't be a dreamer. You've got to play a bit of real politic. If you woke up on the day after election day and went, oh my goodness, who'd have seen that coming, a national government? I mean, to be fair, a lot of my friends on the left couldn't believe that National didn't romp away, so, you know, with more. So I mean, and I think the smart local bodies have already been talking to the government. Don't think that they don't go near them because they're from another party. I know for a fact a lot of politicians have those conversations, and good on them. But at the same time, there's that real problem of what do you do if you don't actually agree with something that the government wants to do. It was very interesting during the last government when things went wrong. For example, the bus-tastrophe, when that happened, I noticed how National MPs very cleverly sat by and went, well, it's not us, we wouldn't, you know, the trouble they had is they invented the system that caused all the problems. And you know, so it can be complicated, but it's not good having a regional council and a city council and a mayor saying, we actually gave you the evidence that this big tunnel wouldn't work, and then we said you should put cycle lanes and pedestrians, and you've ignored us, and now there's these accidents, and there's, you know, we're getting laughed at by international organisations. So I think, you know, you do have to be realistic. You have to talk to people, but I think at the same time you've got to sort of put up things, positive alternatives of what you might have done slightly differently.
I think there's a huge opportunity for alignment between the green ideals and the national government, and I think it works. And I'd like to explain it in future questions, but it's basically intensifying the city. I mean, we've got a whole network in the city that supports a lot of people during the day, and it could do it all week, all night, and it could be much more intense, and it would produce an amazingly good outcome, instead of having two different infrastructures for workers that then go home. It's like having Singapore produce another place for it to live in. It'd be completely intensely stupid, but that's what we do here. We bring people to town and then send them home.
Can I just get you to expand on that, Ian, actually? So, I mean, we have, of course, you know, in the last 20, 30 years, seen intensification in Wellington with certainly the apartments in the CBD. I feel like beyond that, the debate's got a little bit stuck. Where do you see the opportunities moving forward for intensification?
Well, Wellington's remarkably sparse. Like, you could take 50, 60, 70,000 people in the middle of Wellington and you wouldn't get shocked by it. And that would produce a vibrant walking culture, which is already a hallmark in New Zealand, oddly enough. People come here and wonder why there are so many people walking on the streets. It's because 20,000 people live in the middle of town now, and they didn't used to. And they bring Wellington to life. It's just, and it performs everything it should do in terms of leading the way on, in a city, Wellington resident uses 1.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide transport emissions measure, compared with the New Zealand average of 9. So we are producing phenomenal results here, but unknown and unheralded. I mean, it's the way.
Okay, so is it the good case there? Yeah, if you could pass that to Julie Anne. I mean, Ian's just said he sees lots of opportunities for alignment. Do you see those opportunities? Do you see them on the same issues around intensification? Because, I mean, you obviously you can make the economic argument. I mean, the infrastructure is vastly cheaper, obviously. But those arguments have often fallen on deaf ears with national MPs. Do you think you're going to be able to find that alignment in future?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I mean, when I first got involved in politics in New Zealand, I very much believed transport was wrongly politicized in New Zealand, and that, you know, as soon as people who claim to be on the right and care about economic outcomes understood that, you know, the projects they were proposing weren't going to solve the problem, that, you know, everybody could get on board with more public transport in the cities and more active transport in the cities and more housing in the cities and more mixed use development, and that a lot of the problems were originally caused by local government regulations, and you know, so that seemed to be something that you could change and make better and get better outcomes. But it's probably necessary to get rid of some of those bad government regulations, but it's not sufficient. We actually do need a significant public housing build, I think, to supplement the private sector to meet the needs of the most vulnerable people in our society. And obviously, this government is going to be very constrained for money because they've made promises all around the country. And I think maybe the best thing we could agree on would be not to rush ahead with any big capital transport projects before you bring in congestion pricing, before you improve the public transport. And I think the difficulty with intensification will be the ACT side of it. And I'm interested in what you think about it, because like David Seymour and the ACT Party have voted against changes that would allow more housing within urban areas. And so I don't know what role they will play in the coalition government. New Zealand First also seems to be taking quite a reactionary position, specifying that less money needs to be spent on cycleways. So it's just, I'm not sure National will be able to do everything that maybe some of its members would like to.
Yeah, and that, that intensification stance is interesting with ACT, isn't it? I mean, the party of private property rights saying you don't have the right to build upwards on your own property. Pretty amazing stuff. Dave, what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, look, let's just go back a bit to when Wellington was having its arguments about heritage and intensification. Two of the cheerleaders for the bipartisan agreement on intensification were Chris Bishop and Nicola Willis. Then they had to both swallow enormous rats when National listened to its North Shore and Epsom constituents and said, you know, we can't keep this bipartisan thing going. And I think that's the single biggest thing that will stop and has stopped intensification. At the same, so that's, I think, a really big deal. So I think their heart is in intensification, but their party doesn't have it. So that will be interesting. I agree about ACT and New Zealand First. So it is an interesting, that process will be interesting to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the counterpoint on intensification of housing is that you can do a huge amount, you know, still with the National Planning Statement on urban design, you can do a huge amount building along transport corridors, and that's not a new idea. And there are property developers like Mark Todd up in Auckland who said to me, you know, the idea that there's a scarcity of land for intensification, certainly in Auckland, is just nonsense. He said in Auckland there's 50, 60, 70 years worth of building land just around about 10 sort of train stations, and he sort of reeled them off. I mean, is that what Wellington's going to have to do? Look really hard at building along the transport spine if densification in the suburbs, if medium dense MDRS has been kicked out of touch? What do you think?
Yes, but I think there's also a question about what is the future of rapid transit in Wellington, because the current government doesn't have any plans on that. We are going to need significant investment in the regional passenger rail network as well, like to make sure that doesn't fall over in the next few years. And so, yeah, I just don't think buses alone are going to enable movement of as many people. We already suffer from bus congestion in some parts of the city. So that and water infrastructure to me seem to be constraints as well as the risk. And I'd be interested in Ian's perspective on this, because I've talked to some developers who've said that they really want to do medium density, mixed use, but that it's just a riskier proposition and they're having trouble accessing finance, because if something happens in the middle of the build, you can't just sort of sell it off. Whereas if you're just doing houses on on land like single dwelling houses. The land's always worth something. You know, it's not that complicated. So how do we get over the risk, and how do we pitch this, I guess, to a national government? Because if we don't do something about housing, that I think housing is the main thing holding back Wellington right now, is so unaffordable that people just can't afford to live here, and they can't afford to set up businesses and, you know, and be creative the way that they probably could 20 years ago.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, look, I think light rail is the best form of transport in the world for large numbers of people. I think Wellington has got to get itself into a wealthier position before it launches into it. Like, it's stretching it too far when you have 30 years or 20 or 30 years of intensification in the city as a really easy win. I can see that it's good to plan for. I think trying to get it first up is the cart before the horse. I think you want both, but you want the intensification of the city, which produces from now everything you want, and it's walkable. So it's a barrier then to intensification? Well, we just need to get onto it. I mean, it needs a council to wake up and push it, and it needs government to support it. It doesn't need to cost the ratepayer a bean. It's the only thing that I know of that will lower rates, actually.
Just I guess the counterpoint on that, Ian, is that, I mean, some people would argue, in fact I know some people do argue, that it's the other way around, that if we put in light rail, that'll unlock a whole lot of potential. Then it's much easier to get a whole lot of people into the city centre. It's easier for them to get around. It looks more attractive for them. You put light rail, you know, all the way down through to Island Bay or whatever, and then that's actually what encourages and sort of unlocks intensification.
Can I bang in there? Because we used to have light rail, and we used to have a railway station that went to where Te Papa is now. And when I bought a slum in Newtown some years ago,
a whole slum.
No, I didn't buy a whole. I'm not a property developer. When I bought a villa in Newtown badly in need of fixing up, most people went, "Oh, Newtown." I mean, that did happen in those days. My father went, "Oh, Newtown. That's where the tram turned round. You know, that's an amazing place. The wide street, and like we had a system. And when you build a transport infrastructure, then you know the houses follow and the intensification follows, because people, and there's great evidence that the minute you build light rail, house values shoot through the roof. So because everyone wants to live there. And that's happening in the Gold Coast right now in Australia, and it's happened in Auckland, and it's happened in Sydney. So I think, I mean, I don't think it's realistic to think that this government's even going to entertain light rail. I'm not. But at the same time, maybe it's a bit of chicken and egg that you go, if we build some. I always wonder, because let's not, you know, be too nice about the previous government. Not much got done with Let's Get Wellington Moving, guys, and some of those engagements were terrible. Do you want 2 toys for Christmas or just 1? You know, that's not the way to get it. And we needed some Soviet or Chinese style, let's just build this quick and make people love it, even if it's a short distance, to get runs on the board. And we didn't. We were too busy, you know, having these lovely meetings where everyone, you know, was nice to each other. So I think, you know, you need a bit of action, as well as good intentions. But I don't quite agree with Ian. I think you can have both happening. You can have intensification, inciting light rail and incentivising light rail, and then light rail incentivising intensification.
No, well, that's good, and you know you've got a progressive panel when people are disagreeing with each other. For what else is the left famous? It's a good point, though. Ian, do you want to come back on that?
Well, there's a serious lack of money at the moment. I'm not sure if anyone's noticed that.
It has been mentioned once or twice, I think.
And I mean, when you've got a big pocket of it, which is basically the TRO CBD, and it's sitting there screaming at you, build a house. And by the way, with that, you could improve seismic standards, do something about the ridiculous insurance situation, and you would have a humming great pile of ability, wealth. Seems to me it's just a sequence. Well, that's all we're talking about. I think the sequence has got to be get the city making a hugely valuable, wonderful city there hiding. It just needs to be unveiled.
do you think, sorry, I'm just asking questions instead of answering. Do you think, though, that with the number of public service jobs that the government's indicating are going to be shed, that will make it easier or harder to develop the housing in Wellington? Like, will there be less demand? Does that make it easier or harder? I don't know. I'm just trying to understand why in the last 6 years, when house prices were really high here, more residential housing wasn't built from the private sector. And I'm hoping you can tell me why, besides the zoning constraints.
Why? I don't know. Why did Shelley Bay not go ahead? There's a whole lot of whys, really. I'm not wise, obviously. No, I don't really. I mean, housing in Wellington's always been hard, and but the city is the ideal place, and there have been. We are building in the city, not at fast enough rate. So there's still 6 or 7 cranes feverishly working away. There is social housing going on residential, yeah. So the bandwagon is moving. It's just not moving fast enough.
Can I come back to you, Julie Anne, on this question about mass transit, because you've got a sort of couple of skeptics on either side, or at least the point has been made that there isn't a lot of money around. One thing that struck me about the coalition agreements that National signed, though, is that they're obviously interested in the busways in Auckland. 3 of the 4 public transport projects that they want to fund are those big busways in Auckland. Is there a strategic move here for Wellington where we say, look, probably we would ideally like light rail, but hey, that's not on the cards. In the short term, we'll take bus rapid transport. We'll take some massive bus priority lanes from railway station to Island Bay, something like that.
Well, and already the Greater Wellington Regional Council Transport Chair, Tom Snash, is saying, we do need acceleration of bus lanes. In the short term, we always needed that. That was one of my criticisms of Let's Get Welling Moving, is, can we just move ahead faster with bus priority, with active transport lanes in the interim, because the big projects are always going to take a really long time, and they're not going to deliver in the short term. But when it comes to the big, bus rapid transit, that was technically one of the options developed under Let's Get Welling Moving, and the government it didn't save that much money, and it didn't deliver as much housing. So I wouldn't, For me, it's just very, very clear there is enough money in the transport budget. It's just not going on the right capital projects. We could have surface light rail in Wellington and Auckland and a lot more bus lanes, but there wasn't sufficient prioritization of that under the last government, and there definitely won't be under this government, but we can still keep making the case, because there's just, even if you don't believe in climate change, which I suspect is the unstated position of the new transport minister and both the current and the future deputy prime minister. Come
now, they're very committed to our 2050 climate goals, Julianne. I mean, their commitment to some far distant point is unmatched. I mean,
I mean, they really, it's all about adaptation and resilience. They're willing to concede that, but they have no interest in reducing emissions. But even if you didn't care about that, just the straight benefits of more people and goods being able to move around your city at lower cost, the answer is still the same, and it is better public transport all day, every day, frequency, and enabling active transport and designing your streets for people, not just the flow of traffic.
Yeah, look, that's interesting, and I take your point about light rail, but at the same time, I could build a cycle lane tomorrow, give me 15 cones, Patrick Morgan and a few stirrumates, and we could make a cycle lane. It wouldn't be permanent, it wouldn't be very good, but it would be a cycle lane, and this has happened in Wellington. So we can make bus lanes real quick, and they're not perfect. We sort of have the Rolls-Royceisation of local government at the moment, where, we want to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to ask this architect, you've got to do that. No, you don't. You can have no frills stuff. And we don't do that. And I think if Let's Get Wellington Moving had got some really good rapid transit bus lanes, then they said to Julie Anne, houses aren't getting built, then she could say, that's because you haven't got light rail. But at the moment, we've got some great websites and some great graphic design, and we've got some traffic lights, and let's get Wellington moving. And then there haven't been howls of outrage that it's been kiboshed, and so that's sad, but that's the reality. So I think the guerrilla approach is actually much better.
Yeah, I like this DIY cycling infrastructure. This reminds me of that guy in the Aro Valley who paints his own yellow lines on the road so that no one can park in front of his house. We see you, Russell. We see you. Speaking of things to do with roads, it's going to be very interesting right now, test of the central-local government relationship around the pedestrianisation of the Golden Mile, which a number of you will be familiar with, this idea of taking most cars off the Golden Mile from the railway station through to Courtenay Place in order to turn it into the sort of the big, beautiful, tree-lined, bustling, pedestrian-friendly sort of avenues that some of us have been lucky enough to see overseas. Local government very much behind it, central government very much not. Very interesting story in Business Desk today about all of this, basically saying that to a large extent central government's money for this project is actually kind of committed and local government could forge ahead with the project. However, the piece quotes Land Transport Policy expert Scott Wilson questioning whether this would be the strategic thing to do. He says, the council is likely to be within its rights to proceed with the Golden Mile pedestrianisation, but it's questionable strategically if Wellington City Council wants to negotiate a funding package as part of a city deal, and these are the city deals are these things that are sort of now hovering in the atmosphere, across infrastructure more widely, including water and major public transport infrastructure. So, question for the panel, should the council not sort of do the go hard, we're going to do pedestrianisation whether central government wants it or not? Should it be a bit emollient? Should it be playing nicely with central government? Or does it just have a mandate to push ahead with it?
I think they should go ahead. I think they should make whatever changes they can possibly make as soon as possible, because nothing is guaranteed in the future. Nothing. And people voted for it. It's been, all this work has gone into it. It just needs to happen. And once you get a test case and people can see the benefits, it's easier to make the case to do more of it. Now, Wellington's definitely going to need help when it comes to water infrastructure, right? Like all the councils will. But I don't think they're going to be in a weaker position to negotiate that by going ahead. That's my instinct.
Yeah, there was a man in the past called Sir Roger Douglas who I learnt a bit from, didn't quite all agree with him. But he said when you get into power, you've got to just, you got to hit the ground running. You've got to make these changes so they're irreversible. And I'm afraid we took a bit long on pedestrianisation. I totally support it. What is so sad about it is that I reckon 2 years after it, you'd have all the retailers saying, don't you rip up this pedestrian thing, it's great. But we didn't get the clause into it enough so that now there'll be the voices of reason that say, we're going to piss off the government. But I still think it's worth a go.
I might get a heckler now. I'm not that keen on it. It's Wellington is on its knees. It works to a degree, not particularly well, but it works to a degree. So when you make changes, you must be very clear about what you're going to achieve. Wellington is already naturally pedestrianised. Everyone that visits me from Auckland says, why have you got so many people on the streets? We have no one in our city.
Waiting for the lights to change.
And, well... yeah. Well... Well, I don't mind that. I think Joe Wong's rather good, but the civil servants that you're saying are not going to come to town any longer, they'll relieve some of the pressure. Look, there's an awful lot of unwanted irritation about let's get Wellington moving. It's a whole lot of things where old people like me will find themselves coming up to a street they used to walk around or drive around or whatever. Gone, bad luck, bad luck, bad luck. The retailers are absolutely on their knees, turning this into a construction site for 1 or 2 years right now. It's a sequence thing again. Wellington needs trees, of course it does. Does it really need to go to war on cars right now? I mean, is that really a good thing for us to be doing? What's the next best thing to do for a Wellingtonian? Like war on cars? Like, it seems a little extreme.
Sorry, the war on cars? Are you kidding? Oh, you've gone down that corner of the internet. I didn't realize, sorry. To me, that seems like an absolutely ridiculous statement. I mean, I think that...
It's good. It's good.
I mean,
Disagreement.
but if the retailers are already on their knees, then this can only help the city, because it can make it a more attractive place for people to want to live and want to be and want to get around. And that's been the experience literally everywhere in the world. And as you said, we already have 20,000 people living downtown. I think it's a war on the residents of the city to not give them the space in the city for them to get around. I think it's a war on our children. It's a war on our children that they have to risk their lives, you know, and you can't just let them wander the streets and be independent.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm old, and I drove here tonight. Isn't that terrible? I write about cycling, and I'm old, and I drove here. But I actually drove to Taranaki Street, where there were millions of parks, and I got there, and I went, 15 minutes. I wanted to walk, do my steps. I mean, we should make every Wellingtonian should try and walk way more for their health. It will cut down our hospital bills, but at the same time, I went, I don't want to be late, so I jumped on a scooter. We have multi-mobility. So I actually do know there's people in Kandala and Johnsonville that get a bit worried about, they can't park. Well, if we looked at our outer city and we had some transport and micro-mobility, it's not perfect, but it's much better to drive and then use public transport or pedestrian than just demand a park outside David Jones or the latest retail thing that's closed down because no one's in the inner city.
I've obviously got an uphill battle. So what is wrong with my 20,000 people turning into 50,000 people and all of the models changing the right way and not having to have this model which says people are going to come in from the suburbs in their droves? We've got to model it right and think about it and think about it quite hard. Now, let's get Wellington moving and the car park thing is definitely, maybe I used the wrong word more, but it's not making cars feel very welcome.
But I mean, the point is you can't get that many people into the city in the cars anyway, so it's not a winning retail model. And one of the funniest things I find about it, though, is that, you know, everybody worries about the shopping malls out in the suburbs competing. You can't drive up to the shop in the shopping mall either. You have to park outside and walk inside the mall and walk around the mall. So what the mall can offer is a car-free space. And the natural advantage of the city is more car-free space where people can be outside and they can, you know, you can't fit that many people into the city center if they all travel in their own car. But we can prioritize information and better manage the parking so that people who do need to drive have the information they need and they're not driving around the block looking for a free car park, but they know exactly which building to go to, how much it's going to cost, where the free thing is. That's something that we can absolutely prioritize, and I think we should, especially for those who absolutely do rely on cars and who, you know, we can organize our truck deliveries and all of that. I mean, it's all just logistics. That stuff's logistics, right? And pretty much every other city in the world has solved it. I mean, at least outside of New Zealand, most cities are not prioritizing access for cars, and yet they function, and they have thriving shops, and they have people who are disabled, and they have construction workers, and they have emergency services that are all able to access and work. And there's no reason New Zealand can't have that, and Wellington can't have that. I do think the works on the Golden Mile will only get more expensive if they don't go ahead with them now. They'll never be cheaper. And it's probably better just to move on with the plan because it's been worked on for many years. And I'm not saying I'm never going to defend Let's Get Wellington Moving as an institution. I'm highly critical. But I do think the council has done a lot of work to get it to this point, mainly fighting Let's Get Wellington Moving, to be honest, to make something happen. And they should just get on with it because they clearly have a mandate for that part of the city.
Can I just butt in on Let's Get Wellington Moving? Because I've just talked to politicians about this, and I think there's a public misunderstanding. I've talked to politicians who've begged for a for a bus lane, for example, and the mayor, the regional council person, all right behind it. Waka kotahi, nah, can't do it. Oh, we'll get into so much trouble. I mean, they're not even elected, and they have this worry about what the public thinks. So I think when we blame Let's Get Wellington Moving for things, and we should, it's often central government that's the fault. And up until quite recently, Waka Kotahi were just so full of concrete-loving engineers. And it was not the fault, even of quite conservative local body leaders. It was the problem of big brother central government telling them they couldn't do that.
Well, on that point about big brother central government, and since you're talking about getting on with things, Julie Anne, one thing that's struck me is that for as long as I can remember, the last 20 or 30 years, the Wellington City Council has been talking about building more along the public transport spine, along the transport spine from Johnsonville out through towards the hospital. And and we've had some progress, and of course, and Ian's talked about all that stuff right in the CBD. But there's lots of areas where nothing much seems to happen on the public transport spine. And so my question for the panel is, do we just need the big heavy hand of central government to compulsorily purchase all of Adelaide Road, bulldoze it, start again? No, not the bit that Ian's just built a beautiful multi-storey intensification on. Not that, but that can stay. But the rest of it, do we just need to kind of start again, master plan it all for beautiful, affordable, high density, medium density housing with parks and playgrounds and all the rest of it, and then let the private sector do its best architecturally? What do we think? Ian?
My thinking about it is that governments and councils are not particularly good at doing anything. I think they're quite good at setting a structure. In the end, it comes down to individuals and their guts that produce things, unless you do really what Dave's been suggesting, and you get sort of a dictatorial approach, and you just move in and do it. But there's not much appetite for that amongst politicians.
No, this would be setting this. I mean, this would be setting the structure, though. And do you think we need something decisive like that? Because you've put up this wonderful building on Adelaide Road, but so little has happened there in decades. What's going to speed that up, if not a bit of compulsory purchase and then create the structure for the private sector?
I hate to think of that. No, I mean, it just won't go anywhere. You need... This is the trouble with the public view of things, that government will fix things and government will do things. I mean, we take years to go anywhere. Like 20 years ago, they came to me and talked about the growth spine in Adelaide Road. Nothing's happened with it. When we put that building in for the Kiwi build, the pipes were no good. Pipes still not ready. The first thing they said to us, you've got to pay for the sewer to be upgraded because you're building there. I said, 20 years ago you came and told us you're going to do this. What have you been doing for the last 20 years? The answer is nothing. Like, nothing happens, really. When those civil servants and government officials go home, they go home to bed and they sleep. That's what they do.
Well, I mean... on the one hand...
Ian really winning friends and influencing people with the public sector audience. I love it. Sorry, Julia.
On the one hand, I agree with what Ian's saying, and that I think that the public service and local government were terribly disempowered over a few decades and are now in a position where it's very difficult to deliver. And this is something that happened right across the English-speaking world. It's kind of the neoliberal revolution deliberately reduced capability and capacity in the public sector so that void could be filled by the private sector. But the private sector kind of can't really tell us what we as a people all want to achieve together, and it's certainly not going to set a direction to address collective challenges like climate change and inequality. It just has totally failed to do that. But I do look across the world and see local governments extremely effectively delivering infrastructure like light rail, master planning neighborhoods, building a lot of social housing in a democratic environment, and it works quite well. And that's what I would like to see us deliver here, because we know it works. And back in the day in New Zealand, not saying it was perfect, but hey, the state built a lot of really effective state houses, right? And actually did used to do infrastructure pretty well. We could do that again, but I guess it's not going to be in the next 3 years, probably.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I talked to a bureaucrat quite high up who was in power during the Christchurch earthquake in the hallowed days of the John Key government. By comparison, looking pretty bloody good. And they got given a thing that Christchurch could have been built on a really green way, and it was that involved buying a lot of stuff, and it came very close. But the powers that be went, oh no, it's too socialist for us to buy a whole Adelaide Road or a whole street. So it wasn't that it wasn't a good idea, it was that the public perception would be that they're a bunch of socialists, and so that's why it didn't ever get done. So I do think there's a public perception. I also think, even though I'm always accused of being a NIMBY on public media, on behalf of the YIMBYs, people always say, oh, Adelaide Road, fix Adelaide Road, you fix Wellington. You need to do a whole lot more, and the biggest thing for intensification is a mindset change and regulation. Yes, do what you can on even 15, 20 stories on Adelaide Road. It won't solve the housing problem.
As Councillor Rebecca Matthews is wont to say, Adelaide Road is not a TARDIS. You can't fit more things into it than it looks like from the outside. By the way, did someone say Ministry of Works at a moment ago? Good. Very Wellington heckle. Very very Wellington heckle. I like it. Look, I'm going to open it up for questions in a moment. Just one or two more ones. Actually, we had one come in from a Wellington City Councillor saying, and this goes back to the relationship with central government, does central government need to ease off a bit on the earthquake strengthening rules? Are they basically being applied too hard? If we don't get a bit more leeway on them, do we not risk a city which in a few years' time has a very, very large number of empty buildings just lying around? Ian, do you want to... I know you've spoken about this in the past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're driving ourselves down a hole with earthquake strengthening. You've got to give buildings time to be fixed. Nothing needs on a geological scale to be fixed tomorrow unless it is clearly dangerous to occupy. And most of the buildings in Wellington have performed incredibly well through a series of earthquakes over 150 years. And it is a very strong city. We've got to be a bit grown up about it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a war on unsafe buildings. I think it is hard with earthquake strengthening, and like something like I've heard that again. The geologists, the engineers, and say to fix the Michael Fowler Centre, you've got to spend millions and millions and millions, and then someone else says, actually, if you did this, this, and this, again, a no-frills approach, it greatly reduces risk. It doesn't eliminate it, and it doesn't go to the gold standard, but it does pretty well. And, you know, if you think of how long, unless you're Max Rashbrooke doing a review every bloody Friday and Saturday night, you're pretty safe, the chances, even in an earthquake, of it all crumbling down on you. So I think we need to be a bit more practical. I think central government should play its part. Of course, residential is different to venues and things like that.
It's all right, Dave. I'll die happily listening to Mahler's Fourth Symphony or something like that. Maybe just one last question, maybe for you, Julie Anne Genter. We spoke earlier briefly about these city deals, and for people who haven't heard about them, sort of this loose idea that central government and local government might agree to sort of long-term deals for funding infrastructure based on, I suppose, shared priorities, and sort of lock them in and try to provide some certainty. I know you've been a sceptic on them. You called them vacuous in one news story that I read. But one of the things that they might offer, at least in theory, is some devolved tax powers, because, of course, one of the big problems at the local level is local government has almost no spending power. It's all with central government. And there are various things that local councils could be allowed to do, like congestion charging or what I think are called value uplift capture taxes and things like that. Is that on the agenda, do you think? Is there a chance to win those sorts of things out of a national government? Is that something that's important to get stuff happening locally?
Yeah, I do think that local government needs more revenue options, and I think given that it's in the Act and National Coalition Agreement to do congestion pricing, I think that is not a bad place to start in Wellington to deal with our disagreements on transport priorities. Because I think if we all agree congestion pricing is inevitable, then if we get them to do that first, they might understand that the way it works is demand shifts to public transport, and that's why you need to invest more in public transport and maybe not so much in additional road capacity in the short term. So I think that would be useful if we could get, if it would mean that it gave Wellington more autonomy to prioritise transport projects. I think that would be really useful. I don't know what it's going to look like for water, because I think a whole lot of work went into the 3 water space, and it's very unclear what they're actually going to do. And there's no question that more capital is needed to catch up on deferred investment in water systems right across the country. In Wellington, I would love it if we could find some opportunities to do more of the nature-based solutions on water, which brings more greenery. It's just working with nature, with water systems, instead of putting everything in pipes and concrete. And there's a lot of very innovative engineers proposing solutions like that. They're often more cost-effective as well, but for whatever reason, they have trouble getting them across the line with the big institutions like Wellington Water.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Would the Greens support legislation to bring in congestion charging?
Yeah, we've always said, I think we were probably the first ones to have it in our policy that we supported investigating. We've always said, though, that you need to massively invest more in public transport and make sure it's not just a carrot, it's like that's what's going to happen. If you charge people to use the road at peak time, some people will stop making trips. If you still want people to be able to access things, you need to make it affordable and possible to get around other ways. And some of those alternatives might be living closer, more housing in the city. So increasing density and allowing more affordable housing in the city goes hand in hand with that as well.
Ian, any thoughts from you? I mean, in terms of, providing funding infrastructure, what you go through as a developer, the ways that local government allows or doesn't allow things to be built, the way it funds the infrastructure that sits underneath it. Any changes to that you think that you'd like to see?
I think it's the main role of local government is enablement, is to enable things to happen. I've come across a situation recently which is fascinating, which is Wellington City Council has budgets, so it's got a budget for consenting, which is not prepared to raise, but consenting is like is the same as paying council officers' wages. You must do it. So consenting, if you've got a lot of things to consent, you want to consent them in the best possible way as fast as possible. But if you've got a budget cap, you simply cannot do your job. It's just a mistake. It's a mistake. It's a category mistake. Why would you do that? And you find that problem all over the place. There's the unthought consequences of things just happening because that's what happened last year. And now that the screws are on, nothing's going to be increased in that department. So how are we going to build things faster if we've got to wait a year for a consent?
And then if you think about the money that costs us further down the track, it's a real false economy, isn't it? All right, look, I'm going to throw it open to the floor for questions. Now, just a warning that I have, and some of you may have heard me say this already, been trained in the Kim Hill School of Meeting Facilitation, so that any questions, any statements masquerading as questions will be dealt with reasonably firmly. But with that warning in mind, a question. Yes, the gentleman, Philip to your left, gentleman in the floral shirt.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for your discussion. It's been fantastic tonight. I think you've all given some quite good innovative ideas. I think the challenge is how do you get people to move from the status quo? So how do you convince the people to move forward with those, change someone's opinion, status quo today?
Well, I haven't done very well so far.
You're still alive.
What I'd like to say, just to warm things up a little bit, is I think intensifying the inner city does more for climate change than any other single thing mentioned tonight. It does save a huge amount of transport emissions. Guess what? If you're not transporting as many people, you are naturally greener than green. Intensifying the city is so much the right thing to do. So it's disappointing to me that we're not all up chanting, threatening to walk around in sandwich boards and showing everybody that is the new answer.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think for me, some of the changes I always thought for communities to respond on the ground, you need some changes at central government level in order for that to happen. And now it's like you've got to persuade the people in central government the ministers and the new cabinet that some of this stuff is a good idea. And if you can't persuade them, you persuade the public, and you find those issues and campaign really hard so that they start feeling the pressure in the polls, and then they have to act on it. But if you have to persuade the public of something and they're not already on board, it's a lot harder, other than through demonstration. And maybe we have the opportunity and enough leeway here in Wellington that the council can show leadership, and developers like Ian Cassels and others can increase the housing supply, and then we can demonstrate that this really is something that other communities might want.
That's a great question. I would say don't be holier than thou. No one's perfect. We all, do things that aren't good for the environment or whatever. Little things make a difference. And I turn up sometimes, this old guy that's got to do something with his bike helmet flashing, and people go, "Did you cycle here?" And I go, "Yeah, it took me 6 minutes. How long did it take to drive?" And okay. So that moment of truth, an airline executive would call it, might spark something off. We don't need to always hit a 6. A quick single over a lifetime can do a lot.
All right. Cool. Got one at the back already.
Kia ora, folks. Brilliant panel. Thank you, Isabella. There's been some research come out recently that has found that New Zealand is one of the worst countries in the OECD for doing infrastructure. And that's everything from deciding what we need to build and aligning our spending with that, right through to actually using the workforce efficiently on the ground. Also, we're a bit shit at running it, apparently. The government there are signs they seem to be interested in shifting the balance with infrastructure a wee bit. So there's word of them bigging up Crown infrastructure partners and that sort of carry on. A new Ministry of Works has been floated already. If you were thinking maybe just principally about water, what would your kind of top 2 things be for the government to do about infrastructure and how we do it?
Okay. Do you want to go? I can start. On water, I would definitely say water-sensitive design or low-impact development, which is what I referred to earlier, nature-based solutions, would be my first one. And the second one is keeping the National Monitoring Agency to ensure that councils have a clear understanding of what they need, that they have to meet certain targets. Those would be my 2.
Look, I'm not an expert on infrastructure, a glib columnist, but one thing I'd say is the name. Don't call it Three Waters, call it Clean Water. I think if they called it Clean Water, that would have been a whole different thing. And somehow, I totally respect and agree with the idea of co-governance, but somehow take the political heat out of it in terms of structure, because it's just become a political magnet, which is awful. And it's just an open invitation for racism. So if there's some way that water could be done without, and I'm not in any way saying don't respect Māori rights, it would be great, because it is actually about water for people. And I don't know a hapa or anywhere in the country that don't support that.
Yeah, the water thing just has to be fixed. The more we talk about it, the slower it's going to be till it's fixed. So I'm not saying we should start now, but it's just, it gets run around the mulberry bush. Everybody plays with it. Councils have ignored it for years and years and years. It's always the easy thing to put off. At the risk of being intensely painful, when you all live close together, it's really easy to deal with water.
Yes, I've been banging on about light rail for literally decades, and I was on the Regional Land Transport Committee for a while and all that sort of thing. And in all of that time, there were at least half a dozen major studies and even a regional land transport strategy which embraced light rail as a regional facility. And this is the big thing that Let's Get Wellington Moving and those that govern it have got wrong, and that is that they look at Wellington as being only a small city of 120,000, whereas in fact we're a much larger metropolitan area of 500,000.
All very good points, Brent, but
Yes.
I hate to say, what's the question at the end of all of this?
Well, the question really is, why are we not looking at the whole region and therefore the rail transit system that we've already got that doesn't go through the centre of the region? Why are we not doing that?
No, do you really want my answer? This could be quite boring for some people, but thank you for your question, Brian. My best understanding of why this ended up this way is because it all goes back to the Wellington Urban Motorway Plan from the 1950s or 60s, and Transit New Zealand, which then became New Zealand Transport Agency, for a while called Rongotai, was still just trying to get those, that motorway, the road designated as a state highway, even though it just goes through the center of the city to a suburb. And an airport where you park your car. If you have brought your car, you certainly don't take your car on the plane. There was just this belief that had to meet certain highway standards, and that led to the Rongotai airport study and blah, blah, blah. And so the whole problem definition was fundamentally about how do you make the road that we have arbitrarily called a state highway in the center of the city meet highway standards, which is 2-lane, grade separated, and no traffic lights. Because as Sean Rush put it to me, and I think many people do believe this, the worst thing that could ever happen is if you were driving to the airport and you had to stop at a traffic light. Now, if we were actually saying, how do we solve the problem of enabling more people to live in the city, more people to move around the city, more people and goods to move around the city at lower cost, lower carbon, less air pollution, etc., we would have a different approach to our train. But ultimately, Let's Get Willie Moving was set up when the Basin Reserve flyover failed to get consent under the last national government in 2014. And the whole time, even when I was Associate Minister of Transport, the agency was mainly controlled by Rongotai and was trying to solve this problem around meeting a highway standard for some roads that go to a suburb. Sorry if that was very boring for people.
That's a really good answer. I won't add much, but I just don't think creative thinking is always taken on board. I remember asking the Let's Get Wellington Moving people, surely if you utilise Paraparaumu Airport more, and you made Kinaparu and hospitals be able to do more, you wouldn't have need for 4 bloody lanes to the plane. Everyone laughed. Everyone thought it was a joke question. Oh, he's being really funny today. So that's what you're up against. We should certainly seriously look at extending heavy rail, further.
Yes, I don't know. It'll run over my people in town.
I like it. That's good. There's a single answer for everything, isn't it? No, it's good. Right. Sorry. Someone at the back.
Thank you. Cuba Mall was opened in 1969, something like that, and there was a whole lot of debate then about how bad it was going to be. I don't think it's that bad. So what is the problem with Lambton Quay becoming pedestrianised?
Back on that question.
Well, it is largely pedestrianised, if you ask me. I mean, it's got big wide roads for footpaths on either side, and we can't fill them up. We can't even fill those up. So why you'd imagine people would be wandering across the middle of it?
There's way more empty space for the cars than there is empty space on the footpath.
I think there's barely 6 or 10 car parks up down there, but it's just occasionally people drive cars. There's not many cars in Lambton Quay.
There's way more space used that's just sitting empty. Like, it's a vast space for the cars and the buses. Sorry. I mean, from my perspective, and I'm often on Lambton Quay, there's not enough space on the footpath for people walking, especially if you're walking a giant cargo bike, which sometimes I have to. And there's enormous space given to the car lanes, which is mainly empty, except for the buses.
I want to ask something about the earthquake, because I was at the inner city Wellington meeting, and one of the problems with the more buildings being built is the cost of the earthquake issues, and people are moving out, and then they have to fill them in. And I know that the number of the people along the Island Bay route are being moved out of their shops, and one of them is that artist that's at the end there. He's been hounded and he's now sold because he can't afford to upgrade the building, which I don't think is actually earthquake risk. That's the point you were saying before. But overseas, in Japan, it costs less to have your insurance for the earthquake than it does here. If we don't solve the earthquake problem, how are we going to do the intensification? Because people can't afford to live there. And that's a real issue. People
That's
are
a good
moving
question.
out.
All right, who wants to take that?
Okay, I'll give it a go. Well, we need to act as a community. So council goes against its own earthquake cover. We get our own earthquake cover. We all act individually. It used to be commercial, which will be what your man has. Commercial insurance used to be covered by earthquake and war damage. And we need need more of a national solution to this issue. Well, Wellington has got a massive investment in it from over hundreds of years of investment, 150 years. But it's going to be incredibly catastrophic to the country if it suffers a Christchurch earthquake, which, by the way, I don't think there's that much chance of. We don't really get many big earthquakes here. We get bits and pieces of other people's earthquakes. Well, it's true. The Wellington earthquake fault is only capable of 7.5. So we're in the middle of a large amount of Wairarapa, up the Hikurangi fault, Alpine fault. So we get impressions of other people's earthquakes more so than anything else. We might be the centre, but we're not the centre of big earthquakes. We don't get big earthquakes. They don't generate from us out. So no, we need to deal with this on a national basis. Wellington cannot afford to suffer a big earthquake without some assistance from the government, which means that they need to assist us with our insurance at the moment. Somehow or other, we need to act collectively to deal with insurance because we are getting pillaged.
Ian, can you expand on that? I mean, do you have a sense of what a national solution would look like?
Well, Wellington can insure itself after 20 or 30 years pause time. So we need support to get an insurance fund up and running. So 20 or 30 years, not much in earthquake time. We'll be well on the way by then. We need to improve our standards, improve our consenting process, get our engineers to agree with each other rather than fight, which just creates more and more work for them. And get on with it. Tokyo is the safest place in the world in an earthquake. Why can't we be? I mean, we are, as I say, you don't want to underrate Wellington. It's very well built. We went through that 7.8. You don't get 7.8 earthquakes. It's 300 or 400 years you wait for a whopper like that.
Just on behalf of my geological friends, it's not always the size of the earthquake in terms of energy. It's sometimes where it's located, like right under Christchurch. I must say that I get told off by my wife for saying sometimes the best thing that could happen in Wellington is a real big one. Think of the heritage savings, think of the town hall, and what stayed up was obviously pretty good. But I think what the good thing is that the council can't do their own strengthening. And that will hopefully be the saving grace, because they will go to central government and say, you guys got to, if we don't do the town hall, if we can't do that because of our ridiculously high standards, we're really in the crap. And that will flow on, because you can't say you've got to upgrade yours, but come and see something at the Fowler Centre. You can't do that. And so I think that will be a saving grace, is that the council got, oh my God, we've had these ridiculously high standards. We'll lower our standards. I mean, the national government did do a great thing. When they had a problem with education, they lowered the standard for NCA level 2. And you've got to hand it to Heke Parata. The results were astounding. It did really well. Best Minister of Education. She was going from 24% for Māori and Pacific, and it was rocketing up to 52. And all they did is make the exam a bit easier. So that, I think, will happen with earthquake standards.
All right.
Been thinking, I think the discussion's been framed in terms of, should we send our mayor up to cut a city deal? Maybe we should be thinking about sending our regional leaders up together to cut a regional deal. I think the conversation is quite Wellington city centred. Maybe we need to think about regional development.
Yeah, totally approve of that. I mean, we're obviously acting as an entity. I mean, we all rely upon each other, and we are all good at various things. And together, we're much more powerful. That's dead right.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I do wonder if you'd get the same level of agreement. Obviously, some of the outlying councils probably have a different perspective on what should be the priority and might agree more with what National's proposing than the people who it directly affects here in the city, in Rongotai. But yeah, I think it would be good if we could take a regional approach that properly represents all the people in Wellington, appropriately.
Great question, and I agree with you. Campbell Barry and Chris Bishop worked together to try and restore buses to the airport. Darren Ponter is often had worked with Nicola Young over the Kiwi Rail extension, the new terminal that wasn't going to work. Anita Baker seems to have straddled, she was absolute big supporter of the last government's Three Waters, but also works, with other sides. So yes, I think a regional approach would actually make it a stronger case than just Wellington City trying to do a deal. I don't know anything about the city deals because they haven't started yet. But yes, Wellington region is actually got a lot of people that I think could work very well together with each other, but also with the government.
Great. Well, I think that's a really nice note to finish on. Look, thank you all so much for your contributions. I think I've learned a lot. Ian, you've talked about how we need a different approach on earthquake strengthening, the need for a national approach to that. Julie Anne, let's just get on and do these things, particularly around transport. And Dave, what was it you said? It's not always the size of the earthquake that matters, it's what you do with it. Was that with it? Yeah. And in this case, raise most of Wellington. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Apologies to everyone we didn't get around to all your questions, but we have run out of time. Fortunately, we've had some fantastic questions and some even better answers, I think. So could you all put your hands together in a traditional way and thank our panellists. And may you all go safely home, whatever mode of transport you choose. Thank you.